You documented the incredible story of your parents and grandparents. And for those who haven't read it, I really recommend that you do. And we'd love to understand a bit more about your family's background. So, Danny, if I may, could you share the story of your grandparents for us? And then we'll turn to Tamara to talk about your mother and Anthony about your father.
Yeah, so we've obviously got four grandparents, each of which have got their own story. But let's start with Mum's parents first.
Yeah.
My grandfather, Alfred Wiener, was the leader of German Jews in the 1920s and 30s. He'd come back from the First World War, was very early to understand the challenges being faced by the Jewish community from a sort of violent and conspiratorial anti-Semitism that had sprung out of the failure to successfully prosecute the First World War, was linked to a lot of violence that was a product of the militarization of German society. And he, in the 1920s, worked out that this wasn't just a general phenomenon, but this specifically that Hitler and the Nazi Party were the danger. And he began something which is a totally fascinating intellectual idea. He began to collect everything that he could lay his hands on that described them, all their pamphlets, all their newspapers. Some of this was then used in court. So he was involved in suing Julius Streicher, for example, over Die Stürmer. And he travelled around Germany warning the German middle class of the mistake that conservative nationalists would be making to link up with these far-right groups. But obviously his work was not successful, but it did end up with the Wiener Library being created. His wife, Margareta, was an economist. She had a PhD in economics, which my father always used to talk about, in the 1920s, quite an extraordinary thing. Interestingly, this is so interesting from a family point of view. So when I was doing the book, you have to translate documents, and translated documents can be quite time-consuming just to input them into, Google Translate or DeepL. And one document that really defied that process was my grandmother's PhD. How would I be able to translate that? So I thought, in the end, as long as I understand it in one or two sentences, people don't want a long description of that anyway. So I found out roughly that it was about free trade, and I put that in. But before I published the book, I mentioned it at some party to somebody who was both a German woman with an interest in economics, and she took a tremendous interest in it. And without telling me, went to the library, found my grandmother's PhD, read it, and sent me a long email saying, "Here, this is what it says." And it turned out that my grandmother was very concerned about how ideology had distorted the comprehension of a group of German politicians and economists about how economics worked. And she was effectively an anti-ideological moderate, both against the Nazi economists and against these libertarian economists. To discover that my grandmother, whom I did not know, was engaged in a row about the sort of over-rigid ideological thinking of parts of the right from within the right was astonishing to me, because that's obviously been my life as well, and I didn't know that she had any knowledge of it. That I found pretty amazing. So that's my grandmother and my grandfather on my mother's side. On my father's side, briefly, my grandmother's side had been born in Germany. All their life had been in Germany. They were in Holland when they were exiled. But my grandfather on my father's side was in Lvov. When it was first of all, he was in Lemberg, then it became Lvov. He was a very successful iron and steel merchant. My grandmother was a sort of society lady, and then their sort of peaceful life was interrupted by the Soviets conquering Lvov. My grandfather was sent to the Gulag, and although they made it here, he never really revived his fortune. But their only son, which was my dad, did.
Amazing. And Danny, I was looking at your background, your political background. Am I right in thinking that you joined the Labour Party first?
Yeah.
So the Conservative Party. So
when I was 16, I think at that point, my father had always sort of liked Harold Wilson and Jim Callaghan and the right of the Labour Party, and I sort of thought that would be the place for me, really. So that's what I started doing it. But I didn't last very long, because when I went to university, there were all these big campaigns for no platform. right, no platform for racists and fascists. And so anyway, I noticed that quite quickly this started off being about actual fascists and then had moved on to Zionists and the banning of the Jewish society. Anyway, one way or the other, free speech became a big issue, and it took me out of the Labour Party first and then out of the left altogether via the SDP. And so I became a Conservative in the early 1990s. And it's interesting because we can talk about my parents always had a kind of moderate centrist politics, really. My dad was very supportive when I made that decision to join the Conservative Party because he understood the way the left was moving. But I think if you looked at the time when they were happiest with their political alignment was probably when they were in the SDP.
Right. Amazing. Tamara, give us a sense of your mother. Bring her to life for us, please.
Do you want her history or just who she was?
Well,
rather?
you're asking a historian about potential for a history answer. So a little bit of her history would be lovely.
A
And
little
then
bit of
building on what Dan
her
was sharing before.
story, building on that. So my mum was born in 1933 in Berlin, and because of my grandfather's work, as Daniel was talking about, they left Berlin and they went to Amsterdam in the hope that Amsterdam would be a safe place to be, safe from the Nazis. Obviously, turned out not to be the case, and they joined the German Jewish community that was in Amsterdam, the community that had Anne Frank. My mum's sister was friends with Margot Frank, so part of that community. And my grandfather came here to London and taking the library with him, or his collection with him, where it would be safer when that was clear. That was the case. Tried to get them, and did get them, visas to come to London as well, his wife and his 3 children, including my mum, 3 daughters, and it came too late, a week too late, and the Germans had then gone into Holland, and it was too late for them to get out, so they were therefore in Amsterdam. And in June 1943, I worry because Daniel's written a whole book on it, so if I get this wrong, I might correct it. But
correct.
Soon after her 10th birthday, they were taken away and taken to Westerbork, as were Amsterdam's Jews, from which there were many transports to Auschwitz, including of my mum's aunt and uncle and cousin. But they died in Sobibor, actually. She thought they went to Auschwitz. She died in Sobibor. And she and her sisters and her mother were transported to Belsen. So you've mentioned the book, so that so Daniel tells the story, but they were left Belsen in January of 1945 through a transport out of Belsen, very rare prisoner exchange, which they were on because my grandfather had managed to get them some false passports, Paraguayan passports, and a very few select transports or exchanges were done for those for using foreign inmates at Belsen, and they were regarded as that because of the passports. So they left and went via Switzerland, ending up in New York, where my grandfather met them, and eventually they came to London. So that's sort of the story. A rather important part of it is that my grandmother, weakened by the experiences in Belsen, only survived to get her daughters, see them into Switzerland and into safety, and died that night. So one of the most extraordinary things to say about my mum, who was the most wonderful mother, is it's pretty extraordinary given that she lost her mother so young. But she was. So in terms of who she was, she met my father here. She actually worked as a chemist, but then became a teacher, a science and maths teacher very much loved as a teacher and a very effective teacher. She did Harry Borden, who did amazing photographs of, in a book called Survivor, of Holocaust survivors. My mum, each survivor had a picture of themselves, and then they wrote a line, and my mum wrote, in her line was, "I'm a person, wife and mother first, and a survivor last." She was a Holocaust educator, but she lived her life in an incredibly positive way, built an incredible family life for us, and is much missed.
Thank you so much, Tamara, for sharing. Danny, I read an article of yours in the Sunday Times a few weeks ago talking about the fact that when young people today look, it's not young people in general, but some who look back see the Holocaust as history, that you cannot discriminate between what happened 80 years ago and something that happened 2,000 years ago. It molds into being the same, which is why this conversation is so important.
Yeah, so I've just noticed, we had this, I remember going to one of what was in fact Mum's last talk. It was at my son's school, and Mum was by that point, as you both remember, quite debilitated in lots of ways, and we had to take her in a wheelchair, and she was able to give the talk just about. But as I sat there, I realised it was going to be the last time that she would do it, and it was. And I thought, I'm going to have to do it, right? And I actually attended a lot of different seminars, including one that David Cameron had in Number 10, discussing the problem of what do we do when the Holocaust survivors are no longer there, which is the problem we're now in. Ben Helfgott was still around the table for that Number 10 discussion. Now, obviously, he's no longer alive. So we had that discussion, and I remember thinking, yes, that'll be an administrative headache, and also I will personally have to devote myself more to it, which I then started to do. But what didn't properly occur to me was not so much that the people delivering it would be difficult to organise, but that people listening to it would have a different attitude, and that there's a sort of young generation who react to it differently. The first time I noticed that was actually not Mum's story, but more Dad's, that he had this experience at the hands of the Soviets, and people are quite attracted by exactly the same intellectual errors that the Soviets represented in terms of thinking that you can organise the whole economy from the centre and borrow as much as you like and do whatever you like because those rules of exchange don't matter. So I noticed it first with that, but it's also definitely true with the Nazis now that people see it as more historical, and we're increasingly unusual having our parents involved because Mum was only 10, obviously, when this happened to her. So, right, and that she's 1933. She was right at the edge of the people who experienced that.
Thank you for sharing. I was talking to somebody who went actually to Durham to give a talk about his mother's experience. It turned out that the Durham, I think, 14th Division had liberated Bergen-Belsen, and it just so happens the Holocaust Educational Trust sent him to that school, and a lady approached him and said, my grandfather was part of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, which he said he could have sent me anywhere. But what he started with is to say that you're not here as a history class, you're here to bear witness too, because I'm here for it. And it was thinking very deeply about how he's able to communicate his presence, and he interspersed his story with his mother's story as a way to bring it alive. But it's so important.